Hello, Yakri here with another Warframe video. This time I want to talk about the Phage, the Atomos, and how they compare to the Synapse, right? At the beginning of this video, I'm going to be shooting a couple enemies with the Phage, and then later on, I end up shooting some groups of enemies with the Atomos. Just pay attention to those moments, otherwise this is just some background I recorded in advance. Now, what I want to point out in particular is how the Phage, I think, is a fairly good beam weapon, up there with the Atomos and the Amprex, and why I think there's this kind of disparity between these weapons and the Synapse. And it essentially has to do primarily with killing enemies in the series, but also with how beam weapons were reworked, right? So I do think the Phage is better than the Synapse. I was running it with only 4 mods on it in this Sortie 3, and it was actually pretty okay for killing enemies. Not like significantly worse than the Synapse with 5 Forma and great mods on it was. And the Atomos, of course, stood head and shoulders above both of them because it ended up killing groups of enemies in about the same amount of time, or at least killing an enemy in about the same amount of time, but it would end up popping 5 enemies because it changed through 5 targets. It's ridiculously strong right now. It has a little bit of issues in the way of fall off, but not so much anymore with its high status chance due to the rework in beam weapons, and now you can just put corrosive on it and it just kind of like kills level 120 enemies in a few seconds, like whole groups of them. It's ridiculous. Very, very strong weapon right now. Same goes for the Amprex. I'm going to do a separate video on that though. Anyway, so I think the Phage is better than the Synapse, although the Synapse can kill, I think, like a single high-level, heavily armored enemy faster, I think, than the Phage. I'm going to run some tests later, but I got to finish formatting the Phage first. But anyway, the reason I've been liking the Phage better is because it does not have this awkward sort of situation that the Synapse gets when you need to kill a group of enemies, right? If you want to kill a group of enemies with the Synapse, especially if they're not nice enough to line up for you, you have to burn one down, burn the next one down, burn the next one down, reload, burn the next one down, and so on and so forth, right? And because of the rework to the damage windup, right, so it takes you at least like 2 seconds to kill enemies, even like enemies that you should just kill like in the blink of an eye, right? Or you would if without this windup. It makes churning through like a large crowd of enemies, like it doesn't sound like a lot, like 2 seconds, right? But 2 seconds instead of like 200 milliseconds spread over like 10 enemies adds up to quite a bit, right? Especially if you compare it to something like the Atomos, which will take about 2 seconds to kill like 5 enemies at a time, right? With the same windup issues. So the deal is that the Synapse has a couple disadvantages compared to the Phage. First off is the firing characteristics, right? Synapse is just a beam. Phage has these 7 beams that you can converge. Well, if you don't converge them, they provide a great deal of utility, right? And that's the kind of thing that I think like beam weapons are sort of forced into needing by this change. And it makes it easier to deal with like medium level to even relatively high level, like level 60, 70 enemies, especially because there's always enemies that are weaker, like the little volatile runners and, you know, Grineer Lancers and stuff that are going to die very easily to just the single tendrils of the Phage, right, with its higher base damage. Now, that's one thing, but there's also the rest of the stats, right? The Phage has higher base damage, much higher status chance, almost 3 times higher status chance. And you may have seen my video with the Synapse and seen like the status is pouring off of enemies. Well, the Phage is considerably better at status proccing enemies than that, which is quite valuable. Anyway, so that plus the fact that it's got the ultimate alt-fire mode, and it's got the shotgun mod set, not rifle mod set. All these things add up to this nice sort of package where the Phage can do what the Synapse can do, where you single target enemies and focus them down, and you know it's got that disadvantage that the beam weapons have now, but against high level enemies that doesn't feel so bad. And the thing is though that against high level enemies that don't have a lot of HP, or against mid level enemies or mixed groups of enemies, you can stop using that focused in mode and have more of a wide beam, right? And just pop a bunch of enemies. The other thing is that since it has a really high status chance, you can do stuff like, you know, put gas on there to go with the viral damage and just have explosions of gas, combine it with punch through, and you get a kind of a similar effect to the Lanka, which can offset the wind-up time problem. So I've been really enjoying the Phage. I'll probably do a more detailed video on it when I've got it formatted all the way. But yeah, I think that just kind of I don't know. I just wanted to give an example in Sortie 3 of what I'm talking about, kind of another counterpoint to my video earlier, and also a demonstration of the Phage and the Atomos when I felt like I hadn't really given a good one of those two weapons before. I mean, I didn't show the Phage at all before, so obviously I didn't. Anyway, that's all. Just a fairly simple video. Jackery out.